Well, thank you for having me here. And it's a great workshop and a great variety of views, and I think my presentation now would fit quite well. We heard already about some of the aspects of basic income. What I want to discuss now is some of the dangers from a kind of constructive, pro-basic income perspective. And this is based on my experience. My research is mostly based in Southern Africa. I studied the relationship between Africa and the West, so very much colonial and post-colonial studies. And my entry into basic income is through labor and political economy. So, what kind of economy we're living in and what does basic income means, or how many types of basic income can we have. So I've had the pleasure to interact with the Basic Income Earth Network, which is the main global association, and I worked a bit on the Basic Income News, which I suggest for everybody is the best non-fake news site on basic income. So we're discussing with Jürgen how much bad information. So if you want to have properly researched information, do go on basicincome.org. They're doing great work. So I call the presentation basically global inequalities to stress, these issues about where we are now with the global economic order, and I broadly put the progressive perspective. I didn't call it left because, as you'll see, I have some criticism also about some of the left versions of basic income, especially from Europe. I just want to stress here the original vision without going too much in detail. I think people have already discussed a bit. The idea, as it was developed kind of in the 80s by philosopher Philippe Van Parijs and others, of course mostly came from Europe, Northern Europe, was really around the concept of decent living. Okay, now I'm using my own terminology. Philippe used the word subsistence some years ago, but the point was that this was not at the beginning about money. It was an understanding that a certain amount of cash, given unconditionally for life, was going to liberate people from work, sort out the problem of structural unemployment, and give basically people a meaningful way to participate as full citizens in society. This is very different from just throwing money at people. It's very important to remember the original vision, because as basic income started to gain traction, this has kind of been lost a bit in a lot of the versions of basic income that are around today. So the other thing, very important from a Southern European perspective, both Portugal and Italy, where I'm from, it's also not about poverty. We're very used here to this kind of charity idea, which is in a way, a very unequal way to sort it out. So we give money to the poor. This is about people. It's about ensuring that people everybody has, no matter where they come from, what kind of position in society, have a guaranteed income that allows them decent living. So, as the basic income gained traction, the last 2-3 years we've seen, a boom, an explosion basically of debates, both in activist circles, but I would say even more in policy-making circle. Some of, this kind of very idealistic vision had to kind of meet the reality. First is the reality of welfare reform. I think we heard it even from our colleague from Finland, from Holly Kangas. A lot of these debates in the kind of technocratic circles are about how we reform welfare. The Finnish case is very good in the sense that it shows that the target population is those people who are not covered by union dues, who don't have the kind of security that a Nordic welfare state allows, because they are in this kind of temporary work where they never qualify. So that shows, is one example of how the reality of a more noble vision has to, clash with the fact that there are multiple welfare states and multiple needs and issues of what it means to be precarious. The other challenge is definitely that there's been far too much emphasis on the conditionality aspect. So you probably heard it already, several times. Conditionality and the fact that basic income is unconditional is only one part of the original vision, and I would say by far is not the primary. So too much emphasis on conditionality means that, again, we're reducing basic income only to the work restructuring part, which is very important, but it's not actually what a universal basic income is all about. So Guy Standing was one of our, major exponents, and was definitely been leading in making the idea popular in activist and policy-making circles. Talks about the precariat. But my critique here is that too, it's a very unitary vision of a global precariat, very based on the European, actually Northern European model, then expanded everywhere else. So while that has gained political traction, the idea that the whole world is one big precariat, it's actually, as I will show, quite problematic. Which means that another challenge of basic income is that while we have this kind of universal impetus, we have to understand that actually many people, the labor markets are so segmented all around the world that there isn't one precariat, there isn't one target group. So you have informal economy, for instance, very much more in the global south, but even southern Europe. You have people who are underemployed, i.e. they would like to work more but they can't. Then you have the formal employed with different segmentations, from the people who are permanent to people who are precarious in different ways. All these sectors, and more now, what's coming to the fore in this kind of post-colonial environment is separations across race, age, disability, sexual orientation, religion, and other lines. Basically, we live in a capitalist system that segments the workforce in very different ways, with different forms of discriminations, and these are not all the same workers or the same people. So there is a contradiction there, tension that we have to navigate between the universal impetus of saying we want to help everybody, and the reality that a lot of welfare measures in history have actually set one group against the other. So I'll move here to a very good article that I suggest. I left the link there. But if you go on the Boston Review, there was a Boston Review, I think, .net. There was a recent debate on a forum on basic income. So I think it's from early May. There's an article there from the Undercommons Collective. It's a group of black graduate students from University of California, Los Angeles. Basically, they talk about this idea of antagonistic security versus cooperative security. So the American case is a good case. I don't know too much the specificity of Portugal, but because of your colonial and post-colonial history, I'm pretty sure that some of these things apply, especially with issues around race and class and gender. So antagonistic security, in the view of the Undercommons, is basically when you have welfare measures that help one group at the expense of another. The American welfare state is a good case in point. The New Deal, even though it's widely praised, actually was very racialized. So a lot of the measures that were in the New Deal in the 30s and then after, in the post-World War II, were very much measures that helped white work in the middle classes and actually discriminated black workers and black community. That legacy in America is still very strong. So the idea is to move from this kind of antagonistic security, so not using basic income, in this targeted way at the expense of somebody else, towards cooperative forms of security, i.e. how we move on making basic income a complement to the different needs of these different groups. So they talk about UBI plus and UBI minus. The UBI plus is very much using basic income, and I'm very convinced here that that's the way to go, to complement existing welfare measures. So the idea that child grants, elderly, old age pension, and disability are all going to be reformed at once, in one sweeping, basic income, it's highly problematic. So that's the UBI minus, which is basically using the rhetoric of basic income, but without the original vision, to push further market deregulation, further erosion of workers' rights, dumping wages, so the levels are usually set too low, and hence becomes a tool to continue with the kind of neoliberal austerity that we all been suffering from. So I'm talking now about the main dangers. I mean, that was in a nutshell the first danger that I'm talking about, the neoliberal use of universal basic income. One major problem there is definitely that the levels that have been set in these experiments are far too low. Now, it might be good to call it partial basic income, as in the Finnish case, but what does that mean? The problem with the assumption that by starting low, we're then gonna have a higher basic income is that the current political economy is not allowing that. This is not the boom of the 1970s. This This is not post-World War II. We're in a world of dwindling resources. We're fighting heavily for resources. There's huge scrambles for, for getting whatever is available, raw materials and other resources to fuel this kind of modern growth. And there is no sign that this crisis of capitalism will be reversed any soon. So we're talking about capitalism making declining returns, and that's why we have this strong push towards cuts and cutting labor costs, cutting welfare state. So we need to really think about basic income in this sense. How is universal basic income going to be used to empower the situation, to help us, to help people, rather than as a mere tool for restructuring? So I'm quite skeptical of dilution of the definition of basic income. I think actually as a political tool they don't work very well. So my main critique here is towards the monetization of life. In other words, what happened with the basic income gaining traction in certain circles is that we're probably buying too much in this idea that what basic income is a cash payment. Once we give to the idea that everything is about money and giving a cost, we're basically into a neoliberal era. No matter how we argue it, whether a bit from the left perspective, a bit from a right-wing perspective, we're giving into the idea that human life can be monetized in its totality. That is the problem, not just the levels being set too low, but the idea that this magical payment will sort out everything that is human. What we need to fight instead is building on the strengths of the European welfare states, which was guaranteeing free basic goods, especially health and education, and targeted grants for specific needs. That is the strength of the European welfare states that we need to keep. Of course, there are costs, and of course, there will be some restructuring, but the idea that we're going to substitute a cash payment or whatever level to give up those goods, that is very detrimental. We shouldn't use basic income in that direction. We need to be very clear on that. Other issues, and I'm now going towards closure, it's again about this idea of not using basic income antagonistically, i.e. to favor one group against the other. One major lack in the current discussions, and that's been, I think, a major problem even from the left version of basic income, is that probably in the fear of pandering to the far right, I mean, we know now that the consensus is moving more and more against migration within Europe. Actually, many basic income proponents are not discussing the issue, the key issue. If we have a basic income today, let's say beyond the experiments, beyond the levels in one of these European countries, how are we going to deal with the fact that most European countries live on migrant labor? So we have a large number of migrants. Whatever the far right is going to do about them, that's not going to change. The situation can only get worse in terms of precarity, but migrants are not going to go. And now we're going to have a major welfare reform where this unconditional payment is going to be given to who? So now, even Van Parijs in the original formulation talked about citizens and permanent residents. That's not enough. I mean, some of these contradictions have come up in recent discussions. For instance, Guy Standing was saying, well, there will be a gradual way for migrants, perhaps after a few years, they will get it. But if you think about it, that's very similar to David Cameron's welfare reform. So what he was proposing was breaking the EU before the Brexit referendum and saying, well, all we want is the migrants have to wait at least 4 years to get any major labor rights. So this cannot happen. We need to really think about if in most European countries it takes about plus minus 1 to 2 years to acquire full workers' rights, i.e. rights to benefits and all that. The same principle has to be maintained on basic income. Of course, I'm not discussing here the technicalities of implementation, but the idea that we can use basic income to favor citizens erases the idea of global inequality, erases the idea that some nations are richer than others because of inequality. I mean, the reason why Germany is doing better than Portugal and Italy is at the expenses of Portugal and Italy. And so if you compare Europe to Africa. So we need to take this into account so the basic income is not hijacked by exclusionary visions. I think so far, I haven't done too much research on that. It seems that the use of basic income by the far right is still quite limited. But there's a real danger there. Very easily, Le Pen's and Trump's of the world can come up, oh yes, perfect, we got this to help our own white citizens, let's give a basic income only to white French people and Americans and we're all fine. So we need to really guard against that. Finally, and this is going to be more in the global inequality perspectives, is the issue of double standards again in the global south. So the World Bank and the IMF were the same that spearheaded harsh, brutal austerity well before Portugal and Italy and Greece. in the 80s and basically causing millions of deaths in Africa by cutting health, by cutting education, by undoing all the gains of the liberation governments, are very keen about cash transfers. Why are they keen about cash transfers? Because they know that by giving small amounts of cash, they keep on eluding the question, which is strengthening states and giving free quality education and health for all Africans. Now, basic income in that has not, basic income, policy making working in that has not been brave enough. Once we buy in the double standards of the poverty lines, where an African life is worth $2 a day, so that's what according to World Bank standards means you're not poor. But in Portugal and Italy, it's half of the median income. Just make a calculation. It's already worth 5-10 times more than that. So we're using different poverty lines, where in the West, poverty lines are much higher to say, oh, here are the poor Italians, here are the poor Portuguese. But for Africa and India, $2 a day, you're not poor anymore. Now, anybody who's done research that can tell you this is completely off. So we need to de-link the current basic income experiments from the idea that this is about going above the poverty line. So Give Directly is thinking about giving $0.75 a day, and the Namibian experiment was €9 per month. At least the Namibian experiment worked towards a state perspective. Give Directly is basically cash diverted from the states, given directly through an NGO, working very much in this issue of dependency. So here, I don't want to be hyperly critical, but basically, if we want to use universal basic income in a progressive perspective, we need to break with this consensus. We need to break with the mainstream development approaches. So I give the more global South perspective of these inequalities. So just to conclude, I think what we really need to consider beyond this possible hijacking from a neoliberal agenda and perhaps even worse from a far-right agenda, I think the criticism that I want to make on the universal idea is that we need to take into account that capitalism fragmented the workforce, fragmented people in different categories. So we need to be very careful how the idea of universality is implemented. And that's why ultimately I think we need to go back to the original vision, which is about guaranteeing decent living for all, which means also understanding where people come from and what kind of discrimination and disadvantage they've had to experience, and moving away from the idea that this is just about unconditional cash. Thank you.